we can. Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of public interest, the Guyanese at home and in the diaspora. And what could be more important than national independence at this time? And we ask ourselves the question, is Guyana a better place for having independence? For me, it's very important because I was 21 years old in 1966, and people of my generation looked forward to independence. It was the most important event in our lives. But now that we look back for 57 years, we ask ourselves, are we better off as a country? Are the people happier? Is the country safer than we were back in 1966? The first thing we must understand about independence, and let us get away from personality. The first thing we must understand is that independence, not only in Guyana, but in the West Indies, was a popular movement of the Caribbean people. It was not the work of one person, not the work of one party, not the work of people within one colony. There was a movement. I call it the independence movement, but really it is a movement that took place over 5 decades. And it was a movement of dedication, of determination, not a single event. It's not a single flag raising event. It was a long movement. And let us ask ourselves today, 2023, whether the people who worked to make that movement occur, whether that process has achieved its goal of making Guyana and the other Caribbean countries really independent. I continue by saying that it was the workers. Workers rebelled against the British Empire, especially during the war, the post-war years, the stress that occurred after World War I in 1918 and after World War II in 1945. There was something called the Caribbean Labor Rebellion. No guns, these are just workers, poor workers, especially during the 1930s. Many workers were killed and injured. And of course, we remember here in Guyana as well, in Leonora and so on. And in other countries, as historians used to say, even Barbados workers rebelled because Barbados workers were not famed for rioting and rebelling. Farmers, cane cutters, peasants in the villages, waterfront workers, very important veterans, persons coming back from the world wars. They were very important. And one man in particular, or 2 or 3 or more, Norman Manley in Jamaica, he was a veteran. He was a veteran, the winner of the military medal. And he was one of the leaders of the independence movement in Jamaica. Cipriani, all these were officers and members of the British Empire forces. So when the veterans came back, they saw how the Europeans were living, and they came back to this distress which their own people were facing. They couldn't take it. And many patriotic professionals, writers, people writing articles and books and letters, lawyers, counselors. So the independence movement is not just one man walking on water coming back from Chicago. This is a movement that was taking place in the Bahamas, in Belize, in Barbados, all over the Caribbean. And Guyana was part of that movement. We must understand that. We must get away from this great man syndrome and understand that the working people of the Caribbean made the effort and died to achieve independence. They all fought for nationhood. So, my friends, we are, in a way, the beneficiaries of the struggles and sacrifices of the working people of the West Indies, particularly the British West Indies, of course. The Spanish had a different tradition. But we were saved from some of the more deadly and disastrous actions in some other countries, in some other colonies. Some of them were racked with liberation war. Countries like in Indonesia had to fight for their freedom from the Netherlands. Vietnam had to fight for their freedom. Some of you might be old enough to remember the Vietnam War, in which the Vietnamese people had to fight for their independence from the French and then from the Americans to establish what is now the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Others, especially in the former British Empire, have suffered even after so-called independence. They suffered partition. India particularly is bloody partition. And then Pakistan, which was created by the British, one of the most bizarre, products of so-called independence, split again and created Bangladesh after independence. There were civil wars and insurrections in the Congo, in Cyprus. Up to now, Cyprus is still divided. I mentioned India. Nigeria had a bloody civil war. Sudan. And you could go on. So the post-independence years were not years of peace and progress and tranquility. And let me mention particularly what I consider one of the worst cases of post-independence violence. That is in what is now present day DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. It used to be called the Belgian Congo, but it was given independence in end of June 1960. And the Belgian commander of the troops there, a man, Colonel General Emil Janssen, the army then was called the Force Publique, And he assembled all the non-commissioned officers. Of course, there were no black commissioned officers at that time. And he had a blackboard and he wrote the words in French, avant l'indépendance égale après l'indépendance, which means before independence is the same as after independence. Well, they might be black, but they're not stupid. And within days, the members of the Force Publique mutinied. And from that time, in July 1960, there was insurrection, there were attempts at partition. So that military mutiny in the Force Publique in the Belgian Congo, well, the Independent Republic of Congo, in July 1960, it triggered chaos, which you may ask yourself whether that chaos has ended. I don't think it's ended. Congo is not a settled country up to the present time. So independence did not bring peace. It did not bring progress. It did not bring prosperity to every country. Some countries were fortunate. And we must look at ourselves in Guyana to ask ourselves, what did independence do for us? And that is an issue because, as I said, there is no one cap fits all. Get independence and you're happy thereafter. The European countries, the empires really, particularly France, Britain, Netherlands, they left the colonies in a terrible state. And we'll come to that. It is true that prior to independence, during this, what I call the independence movement, there was the enfranchisement of the masses. That is, for the first time, the natives were given the opportunity to vote in elections. Before that, we simply got European administrators who came down. They didn't trouble us with the burden of actually having to vote. But there were mass-based organizations. And then once we got the universal adult suffrage, people started to press for constitutional reforms. Um, because remember, up to 1952, most Indians and Africans were not allowed to vote. Of course, Americans as well were not even allowed to vote. You had to own a certain amount of property, and you had to speak English and be literate in English in order to vote. And that was not possible for the mass of Guyanese people. So there was a broad consensus among people who started to consider themselves Guyanese that we ought to be free, we ought to rule ourselves and not be ruled by somebody from Whitehall, some governor, you know, with fancy admiral's uniform. So the demand for self-determination, the demand for independence came out of a broad mass of people and organizations. And the trade unions were very important in achieving that independence. When it came, people expected change. It should have meant change. Changing from a colony to a nation. Changing from being subjects to becoming citizens of your own state. Change from being in a state of subjugation to one of liberation, which you're free from discrimination. But independence, the act of independence, could not reverse the whole legacy of dependency, of colonialism. Let me tell you, friends, those of you who were there would remember, at midnight on the 25th of May, 1966, when Guyana, or British Guyana at that time, changed its name to Guyana, the most powerful, the most prestigious positions in the colony, the position of Governor General, he was a foreigner. The governor of the Bank of Guyana was a foreigner. The chief of staff of the GDF was a foreigner. The commissioner of police was a foreigner. The vice chancellor of the University of Guyana was a foreigner. The bishop of the Anglican Church, the bishop of the Catholic Church were both foreigners. And the chief executive officers of the most important industries, bauxite, sugar, and other banks were all foreigners. So anyone looking at the face of Guyana on the 26th of May, 1966, could very well ask the question, are we really independent with all of these foreigners in charge of the commanding heights of the economy and the country? Well, of course, the answer is that independence did not immediately bring change. What it did mean in terms of our national security, and I'll come to that on another occasion, is that the British Army withdrew in Independence year, later that year, not in 1960. They were present on the parade in May 1966, but by October they were gone. And that's another story, we'll come to that. But it meant that the state of Guyana had to accept responsibility for the security of its borders and the safety of its citizens. As soon as the British Army withdrew in October 1966, Venezuela pounced on the island of Ancocco. By law, it was divided in two, and Venezuelans seized the Guyanese portion. And quite frankly, they've remained in possession of the Guyanese portion of Ancocco for the last 57 years. 2 years later, they claimed the sea coast of the Essequibo, more or less Region 2, part of Region 1. And since then, Venezuela, now calling itself the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, has refused to give up that claim to our territory. But what it meant is that from 1966, the British Army was gone and Guyanese had to accept responsibility for their own security. Therefore, you can see that independence was a challenge for the new state, for the Guyanese, who became citizens rather than subjects. They had to repair a society which was damaged. Don't forget, at the time of independence in May 1966, Guyana was in a state of emergency. We were in a state of emergency because we just come out of the disturbances which had been precipitated by the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union from 1964, 1965. So the task of the government that went into office, the PNC-UF coalition, was to repair a society which had been damaged by disunity and division and violence. It had to reinforce the integration of all of the regions and districts into this new state. Because the British were not really interested in the hinterland. And as a result of that, you may know, 2 years after independence, there was a rebellion in the Rupununi in 1969. And many of the people there didn't understand the concept of central government. They didn't understand the concept of state of Guyana. And they tried to secede, with the help of the Venezuelans. They tried to take out the largest part of our country, Rupununi region, a region that is bigger than Costa Rica. So that was the second task. We not only had to repair society internally, but we had to reinforce the integration of all of the regions of the country, including the bush, the hinterland. It had to reset the economy, which at that time, and to some extent up to the present time, was still dominated by what I call the Six Sisters. I don't know if the women would object to my using the term sister. But we were dependent on rice, sugar, bauxite, gold, diamonds, and timber. And because of our dependency on these commodities, which were all exported to a great extent, we were all exposed to fluctuations in the international market. If the Europeans and the British say they will only pay 10 cents a kilo or 20 cents a kilo for sugar, that's what it is. You take it or leave it. So the economy had to be reset because we were exposed to the volatility of international market. What they call the volatility, the ups and downs, the turmoil in the international market. But you're not steady, you're not consistent. Independence also meant that we had to create our own institutions, which were not there before. One, we had to have our own constitution. And a significant fact is that the PPP refused to attend the independence talks. So they were not part of the formulation of the independence constitution. We had to set up our court of appeal. We had to create a defense force, literally from scratch, and that is why we had a British chief of staff at the time of independence. We had to create a national assembly. We had before a legislative assembly with its own rules. Now we had to create a national assembly. We had to create a national insurance scheme to look after poor and working people. We had to establish an ombudsman. We had to establish a foreign service so we could appoint diplomats to represent Guyana's interests overseas. All of these things had to be done. And we had very short time to prepare for modern statehood. And in particular, being a member of the Defense Force, I can tell you that this is a process that should have started 10 or 20 years earlier. But the Guyana Defense Force was only formed in November 1965, and it was established only in May 1966. I referred earlier to the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which at that time was the Belgian Congo. At the time of independence in June 1960, there was not a single black-skinned officer in the Force Publique. And Guyana is not dissimilar. And many other countries at the moment of independence. Even Ghana, which was at that time a little more prosperous than Guyana, started off with a foreign chief of staff. So it shows you the unpreparedness of the British Empire to hand over responsibilities of statehood to the new states. And of course, our independence helped us to cement international relations, which of course we didn't have before, because the British government was responsible for international relations, or what they call external relations and defense. So these were almost given to Guyanese at the last moment without sufficient tutelage, without sufficient training. But we were able to move ahead with speed and determination to set up Carifta, and that later evolved into CARICOM. And we were instrumental in setting up the ACP as well. So we were perhaps a little unprepared for independence, but we moved quickly to play a commanding role in international affairs and in the international community. I said a few minutes ago that our country achieved independence during a state of emergency. This was brought about by over 40 months of disturbances, triggered mainly by the People's Progressive Party, which was in government at that time. And the worst year, of course, was in 1964, in which scores of people were murdered, machine gunned, blown up with bombs. This is not something that has been easily forgotten, although there are a lot of lies and misrepresentation now, but that's another matter. Now, we in the APNU AFC, realize that we could not build a nation, we could not build a coherent and cohesive nation on these fragments. In fact, the PNC-UF coalition realized that in 1964. And there was a process of consultation, what Mr. Burnham called consultative democracy. When I became president in 2015, I realized that at that time also that we had to pay attention to what I call social cohesion. Nowadays, people don't even want to use the expression. They're talking about one Guyana and the two Guyana and all that. Social cohesion. And I deliberately set up the first year, within weeks of getting into office, I appointed a minister for social cohesion, created a department of social cohesion. And that department was aimed, right now it's gone, of course, the PPP just destroyed it, dismantled it. That department was aimed at creating a cohesive society to fight exclusion and to promote mutual respect among the various religions and races of this country. Remember the Rupununi rebellion. People in the Rupuni just did not know what was taking place in the rest of the country. We were not a cohesive society. And up to 2015, it still became necessary to establish a department of social cohesion. This is necessary, I think, to bring society together and to encourage mutual respect. Without that, you get social instability. That is the opposite of social cohesion, social division. And the PPP, unfortunately, has decided to scrap the Department of Social Cohesion. And that is now creating a lot of social division in this country. My friends, independence is not about the past, it's not about history, it's not about looking back 57 years. We must be conscious of what took place. But we must give our children more than memories, more than nostalgia. We must give our children a bright prospect, something to look forward to. And with that in mind, I announced in December, 20th December 2019, what I call National Petroleum Day. Many people don't remember that. But National Petroleum Day signaled the entry into the Guyanese economy of petroleum production. We became a petroleum state on the 20th of December 2019. And A few weeks later, a couple of weeks later, literally, on the 1st of January 2020, I declared a decade of development, 2020 to 2029. I saw this decade as a period in which our Guyanese people and our children, generations to come, would understand that we will eventually and rather quickly achieve true economic independence. It was an ambitious plan, but I think it was an essential plan. And its aim was to transform Guyana. And I cannot summarize the whole plan now, but I will select 5 ingredients, 5 elements of that plan. First was economic growth. And I am convinced still that that economic growth could be propelled to increase production in other fields, particularly food security, and not with hemp and roses, but food to feed the poor people. And we need to industrialize. We need to be more deeply involved in agro processing, not just importing food because we are rich and we have money to do so. So economic growth is the first priority of this decade of development. Second is education. And along with education, there must be healthcare. We have to have an education nation. We have to ensure that every Guyanese child gets an opportunity to go to school. That's what the bicycles and buses and boats are all about, getting children into school. We need to have better information and communications technology countrywide. The third element is employment. All young people must be guaranteed employment once they satisfactorily complete their primary and secondary education. And primary and secondary education were priorities. Universal primary education, universal secondary education, UPE and USC were important. And without that, we will find that employment opportunities would be restricted. So employment was the other factor. The fourth factor was equality of opportunity. We must understand that Guyana is a large country. There's a huge hinterland. And sometimes people feel that whatever happens on the coastline is good for the whole country. Not true. We have to provide equality of opportunity to everyone countrywide and also to all ethnic groups and also to tongue and country and also to people who are underprivileged. Some people might have disabilities. So equality must go across region, it must go across religion, it must go across race, and it must go across social status. All of these factors are important to ensure that every citizen could enjoy equality before the law, regardless of race, religion, region of residence, or social status. And there must be environmental security. That is, to quote General Secretary Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon of the United Nations, I don't know if he was quoting somebody else, but I'm quoting him. There's no planet B. This is our only country. And if you make a mess of it, if we cut down the mangroves, if we blister the hinterland with abscesses, saying we doing mining and logging, if we foul up our rivers, our children and grandchildren will not be able to inherit the beautiful country that we inherited at the time of independence. That is what independence is all about, protecting the environment and providing these other opportunities. My friends, let us remember National Petroleum Day. It should have been the start of a process of economic reformation. I won't call it a revolution, an economic revolution. But that day, the 20th of December, and my declaration on the 1st of January 2020 should give us this new vision that petroleum revenues will not be used to enrich a few speculators and a few entrepreneurs, but the whole Guyanese nation. It will liberate us from the stranglehold of the Six Sisters, which kept Guyana, British Guyana, in a precarious economic situation. We don't know what price we'll get for sugar. We don't know what price we'll get for timber. But now that we can establish a modern economy based on petroleum revenues, we can build a modern society based on equality and employment for all and education. We can think of becoming truly independent. That's what independence means to me. That's what I hope independence should mean to you. Above all, my friends, I hope, I wish, and I will continue to work to ensure that everyone will get a good life in this beautiful country. Happy independence. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Let us cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his